Lesson 4, the issue of privacy. Regulators are responding to consumers' demands for more transparency, choice, and control over their online data. And as I've alluded to a couple times, there's tremendous amount of activity here on the regulatory side around the issue of privacy. 5 important things for us to take away in this lesson. One is that consumer concerns over tracking with a little dash of sensationalism has been a primary motivating force behind data privacy regulation that is introduced today. Policymakers continue to advance legislation proposals around the world, and they really do coalesce around a central set of ideas about consumer data that gives consumers much more control than they've had in the past. The elimination of cookies, and particularly what we would call third-party cookies, impacts the ability to measure consumer behavior and will be felt by brands in many important ways. Privacy, we know, will continue to evolve in the years to come. This is just really the beginning to a really sophisticated and complicated set of questions that we're seeing play out today. And it really is most stakeholders' belief, those platforms and brands involved in digital marketing and digital analytics, that a successful ecosystem must do a couple things. It must respect user transparency, choice, and control, while also protecting advertisers' need to measure the return that they're earning on their digital investments. So this is a very complicated set of questions that we're trying to tackle in the privacy issue. So consumer alarm is real, and it is very founded. And there was a great, I think, illustration of the concerns that consumers have with their digital data and with tracking and privacy. Illustrated in a piece in the Washington Post by Jeffrey Fowler. And Jeffrey did a great kind of expose into his use of, in this case, Chrome as a browser, and the number of cookies that were collecting on his desktop. In just a week of using Chrome, he found over 11,000 tracking cookies had been placed there. Now there was, while Jeffrey's assessment was largely factual, there was a little bit of sensationalism. At one point, he had a character playing a cookie as Jeffrey walked into a retail shop, and he looked at a jacket that was $10, and this cookie character quickly changed that price to $100 on Jeffrey. And I think that while dynamic pricing is a real thing and is executed in some industries, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find how a cookie is used to 10x the price of a jacket, for instance, that you might be looking at, as Jeffrey kind of alluded. But the point here is that there is, as we've seen, a great amount of tracking of consumers that does go on. And between the data breaches that we've experienced and, as Jeffrey has pointed out, the number of tracking cookies being placed, consumers are concerned, rightfully so. The 3 primary measures here that we're seeing, at least in these days, to provide more privacy include GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation from the EU, the California Initiative, CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. And then in the market, we've seen some interesting moves by Apple and Firefox to eliminate cookies, and something that Apple calls intelligent tracking prevention, and something that Firefox calls enhanced tracking prevention, ITP and ETP respectively. These regulations all do the same thing, really. It's some common sense introduction of law that gives consumers more control over their personal data, alerts them when that data, or makes it more apparent and transparent when that data is being used, and allows them, frankly, to opt out of that use of data. All of this makes very great sense for consumers. GDPR really expanded the definition of what personal data is, and then implemented these common sense approaches to defining how consumers will take more control over that data. This is certainly, you've experienced this as you've navigated the web and had pop-ups jump at you that ask you to accept their use of cookies or decline their use of cookies. So that is a direct result of GDPR, which is forcing internet properties to be more explicit and transparent about their use of cookies. The California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA, is something that is still somewhat working its way through to implementation. There are a lot of questions about what this really means. Again, the motivation is great, to give consumers more protection and more privacy and more transparency, but how that works in the current confines of digital advertising and the exchanges that go on, there's still a lot to be worked through. There is a danger that some of the interpretations of this law can disadvantage many of the platforms that, again, today, through the digital advertising spend that they are collecting, is really funding all of these free internet platforms that we have all come to love and become a really important part of our digital experience. ITP is a very interesting approach. And what ITP does is blocks, in most cases, and deletes after about a 7-day period, those cookies that are being collected on our desktop. If you remember, the cookies are used to identify consumers, to target ads, certainly, but also to measure the effectiveness of the ads that those consumers are seeing. The effect of deleting cookies has pretty wide-ranging consequences. Brands would expect a drop in their reported, not their actual, but the reported media effectiveness. They just don't know if ads are being shown to consumers anymore when those cookies are deleted, because the measurement component that measurement link has been blocked. They no longer have the ability to target consumers. So some of the relationships that they're developing with consumers who have seen certain products or engaged and displayed interest in certain products, there isn't a way for these brands to put those products back in front of consumers. For measurement solutions, particularly multi-touch attribution models, they become more reliant on probabilistic modeling. Again, there were gaps in the consumer journey that they saw before. Now, as you flush out cookies, those gaps become even wider. So the accuracy of those models become less and less certain. Finally, for advertisers who are building a kind of recursive, optimizing bidding strategy based on consumer lifetime value, that becomes very difficult as well, because you've broken the identification link for these consumers, those that you identified as valuable before, or those that you identified as not as valuable for you. Without that kind of identification, that optimized program that you've built now becomes less optimized and less effective. So profitability takes a hit as well. The scope or the scale, rather, of how this move of ITP really does affect advertisers can be seen just in the adoption of Apple's products. So if you look at the desktop browser market, 22% of desktop traffic is from Safari or Firefox. So that means more than 1/5 of desktop browser traffic has now lost those cookies and has been deleted. So again, if you are building models assessing how people are navigating the web on desktop, you are now doing that with 1/5 the data. 1/5 less of your data. But that's not nearly as impactful as what is happening on the mobile side, where in the United States, more than half of traffic comes from iPhones and Safari browsers, where that iPhone consumer is someone very attractive and important to a brand. You've now eliminated the tracking and the targeting that you can do by eliminating those cookies. And the mobile share is somewhat commensurate. Now, if you can imagine building models, again, that are assessing how consumers are behaving, and now you've taken out this amount of data, those models become much more wobbly. But the death knell for those cookies may have come recently. As Chrome said, they will do the same thing. Within 2 years, they will stop using third-party cookies. The timing is delayed as they try to figure out some kind of other solution. But the idea of that cookie infrastructure seems to be a thing of the past. And that is because if you add the Chrome traffic to the Safari and Firefox traffic that we saw before, you clearly see that there will be no more browsing activity that is generating cookies, or very little at all. Much less than we have today, certainly, and much less than any model could really effectively hope to use. Digital must respect consumer and provider needs. On the consumer side, look, the platforms must be cognizant of the security needs of consumers, must give those consumers control, and must seek to create better experiences. Much of those experiences came through targeting, which was based on a cookie infrastructure. So platforms must find some other way to do that in the digital space for consumers. But there also are very important provider needs. This idea of brand suitability, of protecting the brand equity and value that a brand has created, the elimination of fraud, the still need to measure, all are very important to providers. And really, in this balance of consumer needs and provider needs, they both must be taken into account. And in a world without the cookie infrastructure that we've relied on for the last few decades, there must be some other solution found. We're going to take a look now at John Kenny, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of FCB. Talk a little bit about the sensitivity of brands and particularly executives to data privacy. But John's also going to offer a reminder that we've been here before. Even though this idea of cookie, the cookie infrastructure and the challenges that we see with privacy seem very contemporary and new, frankly, the advertising industry has experienced this and found ways around. So there is a hopeful message at the end of this tunnel. The digital space, particularly digital advertising, has been, I don't think rocked is too strong a word, recently with privacy concerns, data breaches. Does any of that factor into the way you all represent digital to brands? Is it on the minds of brand marketing executives? How does that idea of privacy and concern register?
It's a real issue, especially with some of our biggest clients. CMOs are really concerned about where are their advertising dollars ending up, what kind of content are they supporting, and what kind of public discourse are they encouraging. And it comes down to beyond an issue of marketing effectiveness to their sense of themselves as citizens and moral human beings. So there's definitely, I think, a huge sensitivity. The thing that gives me some solace is I actually think we've been here before. If you look at the birth of mass advertising, it was the penny press in the 1870s, where finally it was inexpensive enough to produce newspapers that were advertised supported that would get a mass audience. And initially, you had a race for the bottom. You had headlines like "Winged Monkeys Seen on Moon." You had the original fake news, and there was it was absolutely terrible kind of gutter press. And over time, partially through regulation, but also partly through, I think, brand building from the media platforms, more established, more trusted news sources started to emerge. And so I think what we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years, partially through self-regulation, government regulation, is the brands that want to, the media platforms that want to grow will better police what's going on those platforms. And I think you're already seeing kind of moves towards that. And I think a lot of these media platforms will, if not outright declare themselves to be publishers, will increasingly act like publishers with a heavier editorial hand.